Pessoal, bom dia. Nós estamos aqui com um convidado bastante especial, que é o professor Gísli Sigurðsson, do Árni, Magnússon Institute for Icelandic Studies. Ele vai aqui nos contar um pouco sobre o trabalho dele, a trajetória acadêmica, vamos ver algumas questões relacionadas também às sagas, às edas, que fazem parte do trabalho dele. Também tem algumas traduções que ele realizou nessa área. Então, vou passar aqui a palavra para o professor Gísli. Professor Gísli, thank you so much for being here in the channel, for explaining about your work, about so many aspects of your books or articles. So, for start, can you explain me a little, how do you start your career in this area? How do you start your interest for Viking Age and for these topics that are related by the sagas of the Eddas? Can you explain?
No, it's quite natural in Iceland is to be interested, if you're interested in literature, to read the medieval sagas. We can read them as just part of our own modern language. So we don't have to learn Old Icelandic as a separate language. We can enjoy them as literature as they are without, of course, some words are old-fashioned, so you have to explain them when you're reading them as a teenager, but then it becomes easier when you get used to the text and, of course, the Viking world. And I was always planning to study culturally related things in university, Icelandic language, literature, linguistics, and so on. But I gradually got fascinated in the academic perspective and aspect of the medieval text, the sagas, the origins of the sagas, the origins of the people who came to Iceland, because there were so many unsolvable problems there to be dealt with. And I like to both the idea of trying to find methods to study new questions and to try to tackle problems that ultimately are not solvable, but they can be discussed and debated, and they can be illuminated through various perspectives and means of study. And that was what fascinated me when I started studying these texts in an academic context. So these unsolvable questions surrounding the sagas about the Viking Age.
That's fantastic. We saw that Icelandic persons are very interested because it's a thing that are very connected by the language, by the culture of this country nowadays and in the past days. And this is very, very interesting to solve. And you have a work entitled "I'm on an Island: The Concept of Authority and Storybook of Settlements." How this importance of this document relationship with the process of the Viking Age to the parts of the transitions of the Christianity by the Book of the Settlements, how this document was interesting to analyze this process of the first settlements to the nowadays that were relationship to the Christianizations in the island of Iceland.
It's a very fascinating question, because it's a fundamental problem that the texts that we have, they are from the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries, and the Viking Age officially ends in the middle of the 11th. And so how can we talk about these stories that are written so late in Iceland as throwing light or informing us about the Viking Age? Of course, then we are dealing with the traditional oral memory that people have of the past in Iceland when they are writing about these times, both in Scandinavia and in Eastern Europe, Western Europe, the British Isles, and in Greenland, and the voyages across the Atlantic to Vinland. But also what is so very central is this memory about how the people first came to this island out in the middle of the North Atlantic, Iceland, which was one of the last land masses of this size to be settled by humans. So the other two are New Zealand and Madagascar. So that are also settled in the so roughly Middle Ages, but only in Iceland do we have a living memory that is recorded by the people themselves of this first moment of so humans coming into an untouched nature. So we don't have anywhere else such a complete record, if you like, of thorough settlement as we have in this book of settlement that goes from every first and every valley clockwise around the country and tells us who came first here, where they came from, how the boundaries were of their farms, and who are their main descendants. So it's clearly a memory that has a legal function in the culture. So it's important to remember who claimed the land first, and thus who owns it and who has therefore inherited it. So it's the right to the land that is part of the motivation for registering all this information. And I often say, so jokingly, that if we had the Olympics in cultural achievements, the World Olympics, then I think the Book of Settlements would be our prime cultural product because of this uniqueness in describing a relatively complete memory of this first encounter between man and nature. Then the problem is, now, is this historical memory or is this creative memory, or are they making it up as they go along? That is one of these eternal questions and unsolvable mysteries that fascinate me about this literature, and what keeps me busy trying to understand what is going on in these texts. And this article you mentioned, I'm on an island, is again an attempt to analyze how one individual that we know quite a lot about, Sturla Þórðarson, who writes the best known version, complete version, medieval version of the Book of Settlements, which exists in more than one versions, but his is the oldest complete version that we think we have, even though there are manuscript issues there that can make this sound more problematic than I make it sound now. But I work with the idea that the version we have is the truthful reflection of the work that Sturla, this individual, compiled, and he died in 1284. And so you can see that he is manipulating the information. He is making genealogical lines to people that he likes and he wants to connect with. He leaves others out of his narrative, that people that he is not in favor of, like some of his opponents in the 13th century. He doesn't mention them at all. Clearly, I interpret as a political motivation. And then the thread I am trying to draw out from his writings and that of his uncle, Snorri Sturluson, is this idea, I'm on an island, the idea of outlawry, how the people of, how they make up the story of the people who go and settle in Iceland, being half sent in exile or as fugitives from Harald Hárfagri, the well-known Viking king of Norway, who is remembered as having unified Norway as a uprunner to the modern Norwegian state. But that is, of course, historically problematic, but that is how it is remembered and presented in the memory of Snorri, and that causes many of them leading chieftains in Norway at the time to flee the country because they don't accept the tyranny of of King Haraldur Hárfari. And I am interpreting this origin story in view of the political situation in the 13th century when Sturla and his uncle Snorri, they are having difficulties with the royal power in Norway. And also the idea that they are fleeing out to the island of Iceland. And the parallel story is when thralls, slaves, that are brought with the two foster brothers that are so the founding fathers of the country, Hjörleifur and Ingólfur. They also revolt against their master and they flee out to islands just off the shore of Iceland, Westman Islands, where they are all brutally killed by the surviving foster brother, Ingólfur. And I see in that story, origin story, perhaps a prelude also to the idea that the people of Iceland, they flee out to the island of Iceland, where ultimately the king's power hunts them down and kills Sturla's uncle Snorri. And a parallel is also drawn in the fate of Grettir the Strong, who is a well-known character, even though in Sturla's time, even though his saga was written later, but the general concept of him and his outlawry and him dying on the island of Drangey off the north coast of Iceland can also be developed into that overall idea about the thematic idea about people fleeing from the royal power or from the justice on the mainland, where they ultimately, however, get killed or hunted down. So that is an idea that is based on the notion that even though you have genuine traditional historical memories of the past, you're still molding them and shaping them into a form that suits you in the present and serves your political motivations and agenda when you are writing your text.
That's very fascinating. How Jesus started there from the beginning of this concept of the involvement of the settlements for the construction of the Icelandic contexts in the Viking Age to this process to understand the documents nowadays and to the Christianity, to all the process of have this impact on Iceland country. There's a lot information, very, very interesting. And my next question is relationship with how the orality and some documents like the Eddas and Sagas make the difference in the stories of Norse mythology and the comprehension of the Norse societies in the Viking Age, because we saw that orality was a very strong point to comprehend this period. But in the next, we have the document that was writing by like the Eddas of Snorri Sturluson that described many things that orality was described during the past. He compiled many stories about the gods, about some very famous personalities in the Viking Age, and how these have this transition of importance to the orality to the writing texts like Eddas and Sagas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is also a very central and interesting question that I have been trying to contemplate and find ways to discuss in a fruitful manner. And first, I have tried to establish that it's not getting us anywhere to argue over individual texts, what is from oral tradition, what is from the author, and so on. I think we have to read them all the texts we have. Now I'm talking about the secular sagas about Icelanders and the Viking Age heroes in the Fornaldarsögur or legendary sagas and the king sagas, not so much the religious literature, of course. But there was plenty of that, and that certainly shaped the mindset of everyone who was active in writing the secular sagas and the mythological texts. All the texts are reflecting the current social oral memory of the time, but always shaped in literary form. So that we have to start there, and as such, they are all affected also by current ideology and learning from all the books that were available through the church and preaching of the priests and so on. So we need not debate whether they are learned or oral or bookish or what. They are all reflecting a mixture of all of this. But what makes them so interesting is that they are reflecting this traditional method of cultivating a memory of the past, which I think is held up by the profession of the poets. The poets they are hired at the courts in Scandinavia, and their job is to remember the royal lineage, the kings, when they ruled and in what order, and which poets composed poems about them. And their job is to know these poems and the stories surrounding them. And in doing so, they build up an idea of chronology that goes 200-300 years back in time. And we see in one of the manuscripts of the Edda that is kept in Uppsala, of the prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson's Edda, that this is a system that the maker of that manuscript visualizes in what we refer to as skáldatal, so a list of poets, a very interesting layout where they write down the names of the kings and earls, and then on the side names of the poets who served under them. And this is clearly part of the curriculum for the young boys, mostly or only exclusively really at that time, who learn the skaldic art of poetry as a profession. So, and that again helps to explain why the Edda or the mythology in the Edda survives for so long, because these professional poets who get paid for remembering stories and poems about the kings that and the earlier kings that where they are employed, the imagery for their poetic composition is all built up on references to the mythology. So they have to know the mythology. So in the 13th century, there's no question of any of the people of Iceland practicing paganism. There are no pagan rituals or sacrifices or any of that sort. But the stories survive as part of curriculum for these poets. And when we read Snorri's Edda, Gylfaginning, the first part, main part of the three main parts, where everything is being introduced to, well, the young students. This is a textbook for young aspiring poets. Then we start noticing that the young students are always pointed to the sky. Everything that is being taught about the world and the world view is, well, either it's here on Earth or in the different worlds where the elves and the dwarves live, and the gods themselves, they are up in the sky. And there is the world tree, the ash of Yggdrasil, that is in the sky, and everything around it is in the sky. And we have these two terms in the mythology, staðir and salir, said to be in the sky as well, and the one belonging to the stars, and the staðir, the places, belong to the stars, and the salir or the halls belong to the sun. So I am arguing that the sky, just the sky as we still see it, of course you see it differently in Brazil because you're on the southern hemisphere, but the sky as we see it here in the northern hemisphere is then what is being pointed at And with the Milky Way as the white half-transparent tree called the ash of Yggdrasil that becomes so white and half-transparent from the white mud which the Norns pour over it all the time to feed it. And then that is how Snorri is teaching the young students all these terms, the mythological terms, and all these ideas about the world of the gods and the imagery that they have to use and as a frame of reference in their poetry. The sky is really the tool of instruction. He's pointing them to the physical reality that we all see and the illusion in the text, which the text refers to. The king of Sweden, Gísli, goes out into the world and he meets these three kings that start explaining the world to him in a big hall of that he enters. And the main idea behind the illusion is that what you think you're looking at is not what it appears to be, but rather this what I'm now explaining to you in mythological terms. And the most direct example is the rainbow. You think what you see is the rainbow in the sky. And we all know what the rainbow is here in our human perception of the world. But that is not a rainbow. That's just your human stupid silliness to think of it that way. It's really a bridge that only the gods can ride between heaven and the earth. So we see in that basic concept what the illusion is all about. That what we see is can also be explained with the mythology in an entirely different manner. And that is then what the magic of the storytelling art does in this episode, in this part of the Edda, is that everything transforms into this mythological world until the gods disappear and King Gylfi is left in the world just as it is on a normal night with the stars as they are and no sign of the mythological illusion any longer. And that I think if we read it from that perspective, we can explain why all these pagan memories are still alive in Iceland, because they are part of the poetic profession. They're devoid of any religious, ritualistic content, but they are part of the poetic imagery that survives the religion shift. And the other main post that keeps the strong memory of storytelling about the past alive, I think, is through the lawmen, the legal action that we have plenty of stories and memories about. That all the sagas, when we start scrutinizing them, they are always about some problems and issues and confrontations that need to be taken care of by the judicial system. There is someone runs into difficulty with his or her neighbor, and they have to call upon a chieftain who takes care of the case, much as we get lawyers to help us in court of law, and they bring the case to court and they try to solve it in a legal manner. Quite often the people who have the difficulties or confrontation, they work it out between themselves in a violent manner, but that is not the ideal way to solve the problems. But that is quite often the underlying structure in the sagas. But the overall message of them is how do you deal with someone breaking the law? How do you prove that a wrongdoing? And how do you then compensate or pass a judgment and let people pay fines and so on? And these are all part of the legal what the legal profession has to remember and has to know stories about, because the law is a traditional law set by precedent, so we don't have in the oral culture so a law code, a law book set by the king or an institution, but rather every judgment is based on tradition. So then the tradition refers to stories that explain the ethics and rules of society, what is right, what is wrong, and how do we behave and as official social members of the community. So I think that these two, the poets and the lawmen, are quite important institutions that keep alive the memory of the past, the mythological memory and the world of stories. And then, of course, we have all the people who must have been active in all kinds of remembering all kinds of poetry about the past and local stories and so on, where people of other genders and social orders could play an active part as well.
Oh, that's a lot of information that are very, very interesting. This is remember me that you have a work called "How Gifts Illusions Breathe Life into the Sky," and you say many things about that. This relationship with the Norse mythology associated with some experiences in the sky, like the gods are in the position of the sky. That Snorri imagines some points of this in his manuscripts, his right, and that's a very, very interesting point of view that we think that many things they are associated, like you say that rainbows. Probably, I think that can be they are associated with the Bifrost example, I think, and this is a very point that was a very good point that for this relationship that Snorri was made in his manuscripts. And I would like to ask you about a little about the Njál saga, and this is one of the most saga that describe a lot of things that aspects of the Viking Age, and how this saga was very related with this context in the Viking Age, how Njál saga have this is important to us comprehend this period.
Yeah, it's again, we have to read Njál saga in the context of the time of writing, which is the late 13th century, when Iceland is becoming part of the greater Norwegian kingdom. And a very central theme in the saga is so how society goes from pagan practices or paganism to Christianity in a seemingly sort of peaceful manner, but still the saga has a lot of violence in it, and quite often the central event, the burning of the farm of Njál, Bergþórshvol, is easily interpreted as so the equivalent to Ragnarök in the mythology. It's the end of an era. It's the end of the pagan.
Oh, so this is Professor?
And then what comes up is a new and hopefully better world. Of course, there is plenty of revenge and blood shed after the burning, but eventually people can make peace through Christianity by going on a pilgrimage to Rome and the only way to settle this ongoing feud that has been going on for generations, with the rule of vengeance and eye for eye, and everyone is defending their honor with violence and so on. That escalates all the time. The only way to stop that is just to forgive. And it's in the end, as people often jokingly say, the lovers get together in the end. So there are two representatives of the feuding parties that they are joined in marriage in the end, and that seals the peace deal. But if we are familiar with the entire saga world, we also remember that that is also how Njáls saga began. The parents of the main hero, bright hero Gunnar of Hlíðarenda, who was Njáls' best friend, his parents were also two members of a feuding party that was where they were joined in order to make peace between the two groups, who had fought for a long time in a very similar manner to the feud that is described in detail in Njáls saga. So we see there's a thematic repetition of earlier generations' problems that is developed in Njáls saga, except that the prelude is never spelled out in Njála, but we can read it in the Book of Settlements, Landnámabók, in a very summarized form. So we can, if we read the saga into the traditional oral memory context in which it was written, we can well imagine that the audience would have been familiar with the peace settlement among the earlier generation. And the difference now is that everyone has turned Christian, so we can hope for a more lasting peace because of the added forgiveness and the change of ethical values that Christianity has brought to the culture.
That's very very interesting, because we know that some of these points that were relationship with the Njáls saga are very like some things like the honor, like the battles, like they can show us a warrior society that was very connected with this context. And like Njáls saga turned this symbol of this how we can comprehend some things based in some points of this saga. And another thing that was very interesting is the Eddic heroic poetry. And this type of it was some things how can I say, it's we can show us some point of view of the society by some heroic figures, and how this part of the Edda can contribute to form these nationalism and some points romantic views about this period, how was used by construct personality from the Nordic countries and Iceland sometimes, because some points that make we see these Nordic countries is by some aspects of this nationalism and romanticism that was used by these manuscripts and books that described these heroic figures.
Yeah, the Edda, of course, was written in the 13th century when the idea of nationalism was not in anyone's minds, but that is what happens with the Romantic movement and and with this sort of revival of the old traditions that comes with it, is the idea that there was pre-Christian culture in Europe that people use here in the Nordic countries and in Germany as a proof of that there had been something before Christianity, which they now wanted to go back to as their origins and so on. And then the text, the literary texts from Iceland were interpreted as being a reflection of this old, not only Old Norse, but Old Germanic culture. And that the Eddic poems, they, of course, the heroic part of them, they tell the same story as we have in the Nibelungenlied in Germany, and of kings in and around the Rhine. Some have some historical namesakes that we can join them with, like Attila the Hun and Gunther or Gunnar in the Eddic poems. But Siegfried, the Dragon Slayer, so the central hero, is otherwise unknown, and the Brunhild and the Guðrún or Kriemhild, they are, as she is known in the Nibelungenlied, they are not as historical in any sense. But the stories about these pre-Christian characters and the ethical values and the idea of revenge and bravery were somehow interpreted in a warlike fashion in the German context, and became such an inspiration in at the time of the National Socialism or Nazism in Germany, that the German soldiers in the Second World War, they had a little copy of the Eddic poems in their breast pocket of their uniforms, because it was believed to bring with it the true Germanic heroic spirit that they were supposed to be inspired by. So that is perhaps the ultimate abuse that this tradition or the traditional material has suffered. But also in Iceland, on a much less military note, these poems, as well as the entire saga literature, was used to build a notion of national pride, used to make arguments for independence, that the people of Iceland were a separate nation. They spoke a separate language. Of course, the geographical unity was not a problem because of the island out in the middle of the Atlantic. There was not a problem of borders, but everyone spoke the same language, were of roughly the same religion. There was a state Lutheran church in the 19th century that almost everyone belonged to, and the language spoken by the people was more or less the same as what all this literature had been written in the medieval period, going back to the pre-Christian times. So people had direct access to texts that were much older than people usually have, and from different cultural eras. And at the time, it was not, that is, in the 19th century, it was not problematized as we do now, how old the poems were. People just believed that the poems that presented themselves as being about pagan mythology were from pagan times, had been composed then and then just written down much later. So all this notion about the ever-changing fluid oral tradition and the problems of textualization, how do you catch an oral poem in written form and so on, these problems have not really been realized. So we can no longer be so certain about this age-old pagan poetry that was taken for granted earlier. But all of this benefited the political agenda of the independence movement and so on, to have this medieval literature to stand on as a matter of national pride. So it led to the manuscripts with these texts playing also a symbolically very important role in all the political movement around the independence and state building in Iceland, as the sagas about the Norwegian kings had played a very strong role in the making of the modern Norwegian state. And similarly, Sweden and Denmark had used the medieval texts about their respective histories quite a lot in the nation building processes in the 17th and 18th centuries. So Iceland was perhaps just a bit later in that process, but also benefited quite a lot from the Romantic ideology that played into this and was perhaps in many ways parallel with the development in Ireland, where in a similar fashion, poets working with medieval literature in the Irish language were going hand in hand with the political movement of the 19th century for independence from England at the time. So I think as such the literature was then after Iceland finally became an independent republic in 1944, the main issue that was still left to be solved between Iceland and Denmark, which we had been a part of up to then, was to get the manuscripts back home, as it was, the slogan. Because the University of Iceland had been in Copenhagen during these ages, and all academic activity had taken place there. So manuscripts had been collected in Iceland, brought to Denmark for study, and then documents, of course, in Danish archives. So the idea was that now that we were independent again, we should get these documents back from Denmark. And this was a political debate that went on for years and was finally solved in the early 1960s. And the decision was challenged and in the court system in Denmark, and it took until 1971 to solve. So we ended up by splitting the manuscript collection in Danish libraries, and those that belong or contain material concerning Scandinavian history, they stay in Copenhagen, and those who are more focused on Icelandic matters have been returned to Iceland, and there are of course many exceptions though from that rule. But that just shows how ideologically and politically important these works can be, both for good and not so good causes. And we still see now in all kinds of neo-Nazi, ultra-right-wing movements that they are evoking again some of these same connections that the Nazi Germany was using at the time. So, which is of course quite unpleasant from our modern scholarly perspective.
That's a very good thing that you say about that you described this path of this transition of the documents that are related with a history that some parts of Iceland was in a group of like countries that were part of another country that was a kingdom that Norway was annexed Iceland, and this is a very nice thing that Denmark give back the documents to Iceland, to the possibility these stories to about this period. And this is a very nice saw that, because we saw that a construction of this how can I say, a nationalism and romanticism about these countries, but it was generated by some documents that are analyzing that by the Eddas and sagas and some others that say um, you, you say about the example the Volsunga saga that express this type of um, this interest by the Nordic culture in a nationalism, and for good and for bad, because in the Second World War the Volsunga saga was used by bad ideologies in the Second World War, and so in some point this possibility a culture created by the theater, by movies, and by many things that are relationship with this culture based on in these documents. And it's I saw that it was a very interesting thing about this period, and you say I think that it was very good relation with the documents that they are give back to Iceland, to the stories, because they originate some of this oral system and some of these writings um, about the Norse mythology that we know in nowadays, and that's very very nice to saw that. And Iceland is the center of everything. You can say that because uh, they have these documents, these traditions, these language that possibility us comprehend this period to study, and that's a very nice thing. And we saw that in some point of the sagas of Icelanders, we saw that we have a very a very how can I say, a very interesting part of that was the discovery of the Greenland in the Vinland sagas, and how this changed the course of that we know about these create of new settlements, create of a new um, mode of making life in another place that was a difficult place like Vinland or Greenland, and how this is very relationship with the saga of Icelanders, how Greenland change everything that we know in some points of writings, and how the Vinland sagas are very contemplated by some documents that show many points of this about the process of colonization of another parts of the world.
Yeah, of course, the Vinland sagas, they describe a very unsuccessful attempt to go and live in a place far away. And I think they explain also quite well why it didn't succeed. They are just on their ordinary Viking ships, of course, with all the iron swords and spears and knives and weapons, axes that they know and have with them, and probably better weapons in combat than what the Native Americans had, except that, of course, they would have had arrows and bows and so on, but not the iron weapons that the Norsemen had. But the way the sagas remember this, and again we have to read them as the memory that is brought back to Iceland and then told for generations there to new audiences about the voyages of the past that the forefathers and foremothers of the storytellers went on. But so the stories must be read that as the message to the people at home about what it was like and why they didn't again succeed or continue. And one of the things that is quite clear is that it's far, far away. So the sailing is very difficult. On one of the major voyages that is described or remembered in the sagas, out of 3 ships that go, only 1 returns because they are lost at sea and they break their ships and so on. So if you are an investor and this is the risk that you have to take, you have to build 3 ships and expect to lose 2, and then you will think twice before you make a decision to invest in an adventure like that. So that is the first overall message of the sagas. The other is that even though you can stay in places where there are no natives, so you can stay and do whatever you like. If you really want to get into the part of the land that is nice and warm and with the wine and grapes and things that are remembered and the big salmon in this new world, then the land is already heavily populated. And even though you try to have a sort of business relations with them, exchange of goods and so on, there is so much cultural difference, a language barrier. They don't understand, the misunderstandings come up quite easily that lead to escalated violence. So that is a problem that they also know in the sagas from when you go into countries like Ireland, where people don't speak anything but Irish. Then they run into difficulties in communicating. So they don't always have interpreters that can help them with the Irish. So if you are going to a culture where you cannot make yourself understood, then you clearly have to be careful. That is another message of the sagas, and also because of how far away this is and how long it takes to get there. You cannot just go with your entire family, and so it's a very male-dominated group of people who go on these voyages. And what happens if you have a lot of males together for a long time? They get also violent amongst themselves. So it's problematic to have go on these voyages because of just internal problems with communicating with the natives, and also just how far and dangerous the voyage is. So even though they had technically the ships and technique to make the crossing, they were not sort of good enough or safe enough to make it commercially viable. And that is the memory or the story that they tell back home to the audience there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting story, and doing more research about it, because we have an animation made by the Japanese, an anime called the Vinland Saga, and they turned very popular, this story. And so personages like Thorfinn Karlsfini, many of others personages that turned possible on the script, but Vinland Saga was I think that don't have a good end. It's not possible for the Nordics turn an effective home. They have to they try many things to try to survive this place, but it's not possible. And we have some archaeological researchers that show many things that are in this area that are related with the like in Asia, in the period in the violent sagas, or in the places in North America. And One of the most interesting documents is, I think, in the Poetic Edda is Völuspá, and they show many aspects of the beginning the of the everything and to the end of principle the end of many of the things in the Norse mythology, and how Völuspá give the ideas of the concept of Ragnarok, how Völuspá, the prophecy of the Volva can give Odin some aspects that will show us an aspect of judgment day in the Norse mythology.
Yeah, it's again, Völuspá is written in this manuscript, the Poetic Edda, in the latter half of the 13th century, which is a very Christian era at the time. So it's a puzzle why such a poem is still alive on the lips of performers of poetry. And we have to be open to the idea that it has absorbed Christian ideas, and they have certainly heard the biblical descriptions of the end of the world and we can see even in the vocabulary in Völuspá when the sun is turning black and so on. That's a very similar imagery as we have in the biblical language, and also the idea of seeing into the future, to have get the wisdom to prophesize about what will happen. Visionary literature is, of course, a well-known genre in the Middle Ages and ever since biblical times even, that in order to get a vision, prophetic vision, you, as a human, even though you are a vulva, you don't get that on your own. You need some contact with the other world, with the divine forces. And I have been arguing that that is how we should read the middle part, or in Völuspá, where the vulva has described the past, the creation of the world, and how the problems in our world started with greed and violence and oath breaking and so on. That is all because of the gold that is brought into the world. And before she starts prophesying about what will happen, and then the Ragnarök, of course, are the immediate threat, she describes her encounter with Odin. And I have argued that this is a very similar scene, just as in the visionary literature of Europe, that in order to see into the future, see into the other world, you need a divine guidance. Someone from the world of gods, the divine world, comes to you, and that is the pagan practice, as it is referred to in the law codes and several narrative texts, of sitting outside. That is what the people who are practicing magic do. They go out, sit out in the night. Often we have stories about that being done on crossroads. They are, for some reasons, thought to be assembling the forces from the other side in a powerful manner. And when you sit outside alone in the dark, you can evoke the spirits or the divine beings, and they come to you and they bring you visions. They can bring you gifts and so on, and they can tempt you. And if you manage to resist all the temptation, then you get the benefits of the encounter with the other world. And that is what the Völva is describing there, I think, that she gets into touch with Odin, and he opens up the vision into the future that she shares with us, that Baldur will be killed, the symbol of good and innocence, and after that there's no return to until after Ragnarök, when of course everything perishes and is part, or is the central piece of her vision, and then in again biblical fashion the world rises up again, where all the good and innocent enjoy living happily ever after, so to speak. So there's a heavenly Jerusalem that she sees in her vision after Ragnarök, rising up with the image of the place called Gísli. So the images there, it has even been argued, may have been influenced by visual arts from the Byzance, Eastern Europe, where people of Scandinavian origins were traveling and would have seen artwork in the 11th, 12th, and even 13th centuries, and some of that may have inspired them in the way they described the end of the world in their poetry. So Völuspá is, I think, no doubt a very old Norse version of the origin story and the story about the end of the world, but still must have been, as all oral living texts are, open to influences in the 11th, 12th, 13th centuries of images, texts, and stories about similar matters, and not least the literary form of visionary literature that suits this kind of prophecy quite well, and is only found in one of the two versions of Völuspá. The other main version, in a slightly younger manuscript, does not have this visionary idea written into it.
That's very interesting about how the Völuspá have this impact in comprehend one of the most aspects that are very how can I say, they are very important for comprehend some part of this mythology, because it's from the beginning to the end of some part of everything in the mythology, and this presence of Volvo explaining some aspects of this turned this document, I think, one of the most studied and very for the readers of and passions of the Norse mythology. I think it's one of the most analyzes and very interested to comprehend many aspects of the gods, of the local places related of the Norse mythology. And you work with an article called Thor and Midgard Serpent, One Should We Read Snorri or Finnur. And we have a figure, I think it is Finnur Johnson of the Icelandic, that a philologist that work a lot with this type of document. And Finnur, what's one of the most important of Finnur to comprehend the work of Snorri? He's work a lot with this part of the and how he was he present this part of this comprehend of this how can I say, this part of the mythology, how this is a very studied by him, and how he can contribute for us understand many aspects of the work of Snorri.
Yeah, Finnur, of course, was the most important editor of the early 20th century, and did marvelous editions of many of the central texts. So this article you refer to is very much about methodology. And at the time Finnur was editing his text, people were convinced of the model that what the manuscripts contained were quite often versions of other original and quite often better texts that were sometimes lost or just fragmentary preserved, and that Snorri had been also like a scholar using sources and reconstructing some picture of Norse paganism from the sources. So in the edition which of the Skaldic poems that Finnur Jónsson prepared, and that's why I'm asking this question, who should we use, Finnur or Snorri? Finnur takes apart all the poems that Snorri refers to. Snorri mentions different authors for the individual stanzas that he cites, either or only half of them or in complete form. And Finnur reconstructs these fragments into complete or partly complete poems by these different authors from different eras, and sets them up in his edition as starting with the oldest poems, all by this named author, then the next named author, and so on, ending with anonymous poetry. So in the particular instance I am writing about, there is all the Skaldic poems that mention the mythological moment when Thor encounters the Midgardsormur, or the Midgard serpent. And traditionally we hear that this is mentioned in a lot of Skaldic poems, so it has been quite a popular theme for the Skalds. And as we can see in Finnur Jónsson's edition, it's in this poem, it's in this poem, and the other, and so on, from different periods. But when we start looking at where all these poems come from, we see that they are all bundled together in one part of Snorri's Edda, when he is explaining how we can have poetical circumlocutions about Thor, how we can refer to Thor, the god that is main agent in these verses. So I am suggesting that perhaps we should read all these stanzas in the context that Snorri has them, because Snorri is really our source. It's not that as if Snorri is a scholar like us, working with sources and doing something with them, but rather if we read Snorri as we would as field workers in anthropology or folklore, we would go out and ask people about their own tradition. And Snorri is a unique example of that. He tells us everything, or not everything, of course, but quite a lot of what he knows in written form about the mythology and the poetic art and the poetic diction. If we accept Snorri as we would accept the information from all informants in any fieldwork in ethnology, folklore, anthropology, and so on, then we must take seriously how he puts together his poetic examples. And I'm arguing that the way he arranges the verses is perhaps still one more version of the myth about Thor's fishing for the Midgard serpent, that he puts them into a storyline that can be read as such, because he also tells us the story in prose form. We have the story in one Eddic poem, and then we have it in this fragmentary form in different Skaldic poems that Snorri cites, but he cites them in a certain order that can also make sense as one more version of the story. So that is the point, that we should read the poems in the original context in the sources rather than in the reconstructed way in our printed editions.
That's a very good analysis, because Finnur was a famous, how can I say, philologist, and he's analyzed some good points from the medieval citing and the translation of the Edda, and many points related with the Old Norse poetry. And I have a lot of works, I don't know if I pronounce correct, is the Icelandic thing, I think. And this work is show many aspects of this cultural tradition, for the oral tradition, to comprehend the script traditions, manuscript traditions from Snorri. And this is a very nice point that you show us about this relationship with the two authors in this event, like the fishing of the serpent of Midgard. And for my last question, Professor, I'd like to explain how much the Christianity was related with the Norse events in mythology. How can I say that? Snorri was in the period that we start in a point that the Christianity was very diffused in Iceland, and many of the aspects that he put in some events in the Norse mythology have some connections with a perspective with the Christians, put in the perspective of the Norse society paganism. How do you explain that these connections with these two sides of the same coin?
Yeah. As I say, it's the same problem there as with everything else, that all texts reflect their time of writing, and they all are influenced by current thinking when they are written. So current learning, in this case, Christianity. So I think it's a hopeless exercise to try to differentiate between pagan and Christian, in the sense that people did in Finnur Jonsson's time, and some are even still trying to do. I think we need a fundamental methodological change in our approach to the texts that allows for or enables us to think about them as being sort of both at the same time. That they are clearly the Eddas and the sagas of Icelanders, they are clearly based on a tradition of oral memory about the past, about the secular events, about mythological ideas, and so on. But at the same time, because they have been alive in people's memories for so long, they have absorbed all kinds of new ideas that have come along. So there's no question of any of this material being purely pagan in a sort of 10th or 9th century sense. But it's all sort of traditional memories about the pagan past, that some of which have been reinforced with Christian ideas, like Christian vocabulary about the end of the world, the apocalypse, that can easily affect the vocabulary in Völuspá in the description of Ragnarök. So, because people are essentially expressing the same ideas, that somehow the world will perish, the world we live in, and if you already have written influential texts describing that, and you also have your oral traditional memory in poetry, how your ancestors thought about similar things, you are bound to mix the two together. Not to mention, if you as well in the meantime you see sort of visual art on your travels on the continent, how artists have expressed their vision of the apocalypse, then that also affects the way you continue reciting your old, seemingly pagan poem, but that is starting to absorb Christian imagery and Christian ideas. Snorri also, when he writes his textbook for the poets that accidentally becomes our main source for the pre-Christian mythology, he makes sure that we should not believe any of this. This is just mistakenly taken for being gods, these characters. We all know that God created the world the way we read in the Bible, so this is just misconceptions that people had because they didn't know any better. And so he is quite clear on that it's not a matter of believing, but it's a matter of explaining the world that we see in front of us in mythological terms, as we still use the Greek and Roman terms for the star sky. We talk about Jupiter and Mars and Saturn and Venus and so on. So deities, classical deities, but we don't believe in any of those. But these have just become names for celestial phenomena. And that is also how all this mythological terminology could survive in the minds of the poets. It's as mythological terminology for what they see in the sky, which is useful for their poetic profession, but it's not a matter of believing or practicing paganism any more so than we do with our classical pagan terminology. And then we have, in the last decades, become aware that all cultures around the globe, in South America, North America, Australia, Asia, and Africa, they all have their native terminology for the sky. All mythologies are referring to the sky in the different cultures around the globe, and some have been demonstrated to be very advanced in their celestial observations, even though they have just been done sort of orally through storytelling and poetry from generation to generation. So, like it's now becoming apparent in Australia among First Nations there. So I suspect that similar things are bound to come up in South America as well in the study of native cultures there. So it's a fascinating way of approaching the mythology, that it is a reflection of this old scientific observation of the sky expressed in mythological terms, but not a world of fantasy or something that should be believed in, but rather a symbolic way of describing the world we live in. And as such, I think we can understand the notion of myth and religion in a much better way than taking it literally as fundamentalists tend to do with religious ideas.
No, that's fantastic. It's a very impact that we saw that is have many connections with the these two sides put in this document, because it's not a document properly pagan, but it's a document that was registered in some aspects of our past, that was put in with some things that were related with the period of their writers. And this is one of the most, I think, important aspects to comprehend the this type of analyze this document like the Poetic Edda or the Prose Edda, and this is a very nice point that you described that. And Professor, I would like to thank you so much for doing this interview. It's a very pleasure receiving you. It's an amazing opportunity to talk to you because you have a very nice work within so many translations, many books, many articles about the Old Norse, and for they contribute to us to comprehend many aspects of the Norse mythology and aspects of the Icelandic country by the language. And this is my very thankful for your presence here.
Well, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you.